Okay, thanks. So I'm really excited to be here today, and this is an area of research that I'm really excited about and very passionate about. And it's actually research that started when I was, I think, my sophomore year of my undergraduate studies. So it's something that I've carried with me throughout even my time here at Emory, even though it's not my primary focus for my dissertation research. So for my dissertation itself, I'm looking more at how bone density changes across the life course, and in particular among females who are pregnant during adolescence. And so for today, I've got a couple of these 4 questions that by the end of today you should be able to answer with multiple different types of evidence. So the first is, what are the primary modes of subsistence across history? The second is, how does agriculture and the different ways in which people get food affect how societies impact health? And what types of evidence do we have that kind of tells us what we know about health in prehistory? The third is, how does food production affect social organization, and the converse, how does social organization affect how we get food? And the last one is, what types of evidence can we use, both in terms of whether it's skeletal or other types of archaeological evidence? And so first I just want to start, and please feel free to ask questions, talk back. I really want this to be as interactive as we can. So what are some of the different modes of subsistence that you can think of? What are the different types of ways in which humans can acquire food? Yeah.
Foraging.
Foraging. Okay. And so this, you could also call it hunting and gathering. That's another commonly used term. What's another?
Farming.
Yeah. Or farming. Yeah. So agriculture. What would be another? Yeah. Pastoralism. And does everyone know what pastoralism is? Like, who could describe what pastoralism is? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, so it's having kind of dominating a herd of animals that kind of move with you. So if you're a pastoralist society, you may have a home base, like a region that you return to regularly, but overall you tend to be moving throughout the season so that you travel with the herd to take advantage of, for example, like changing patterns of grasslands. You don't want to stay somewhere where you have no food to feed your animals, essentially. And are there any others that you can think of?
Industrial agriculture?
Yeah, industrial agriculture or agribusiness. And so this is something that's really changed really within our lifetimes, within my lifetime, where the rate of production has increased dramatically. And so we'll talk more about this in relation to how we see even culture today changing in relation to the development of these big, massive farms. And so I want to kind of situate this a little bit with a timeline. So imagine here that this represents the last 200,000 years. So this really, relative, from an evolutionary point of view, this is actually still even a very small bit of time. And so about 200,000 years ago, we have the first, earliest recognized evidence of Homo sapiens, so our own genus, our own species. And when you think about when agricultural practices begun about 10,000 years ago, you can think even within our own species, we have this entire stretch of history in which the predominant form of agriculture was the predominant form of food production was hunting and gathering or some form of pastoralism. And so really, in the last 200 years is when we see the Industrial Revolution, GMO crops, all of this major change that's happened just within the last couple of centuries. And so when you're thinking about this in terms of health, if you have this long evolutionary history where you have a very diverse range of consumption patterns, which we'll talk more about, in comparison to agriculture, where you're really starting to narrow in and focus on very particular types of plants or animal species, you can think that this starts to kind of trigger the thought that what are we doing to our bodies and how does this affect our health? And so just like the big takeaway message here is that agriculture, especially as we see it today in the grocery stores around us, has been incredibly, incredibly brief. And so you can imagine that our bodies are not particularly well adapted to some of these types of foods that we're actually consuming on a day-to-day basis. And also that even for plants and animals, the different like nutritional components found within them have been changing drastically as well. So for example, like fat content in beef is different today than it was even 30 years ago, 50 years ago. And then if you think back on an evolutionary timescale, wild game has increased protein content and decreased fat content. So the types of foods that our body has evolved to digest, we're not necessarily feeding those foods to ourselves anymore. Okay, and so I want to kind of frame this. I've been trained as an anthropologist, and so this is kind of a theoretical component that I wanted to bring in. And so would you say true or false? Each culture or society goes through a discrete process of development that moves them from a period of savagery to true civilization. What would you say to that? Sure.
I would say false.
False? Why would you say that that's false?
Well, it brings up the issue, or the topic of cultural relativism, like what is savagery and what is true civilization.
Right, so really the statement is trying to say that we can discretely compare different groups to one another, and it really adds this like temporal aspect that over time the whole, like this, our entire civilization has kind of traveled in one direction. And so this would definitely be, from my point of view and from the viewpoint of many other theorists, would be false. But this was a very predominant theory. Lewis Morgan is an American anthropologist who really had this theory of social evolution or cultural evolution, where you could very discreetly place different cultures or different societies through these 7 stages of development. And so, for example, from this framework, you would go and say, well, we're going to examine this tribe in the Amazon. We're going to examine what types of tools they use, what types of food they eat, what types of clothes they wear even, and we can put them on one of these points in the scale. And of course, 19th century Victorian United States framework puts all of us in the civilized category. And so this was like a very comparative aspect. And so Morgan actually uses agriculture in order to prove his point and to really represent his theory. And so with Morgan's work, he goes from lower savagery, our groups that have fruit and nut subsistence, all the way through civilization with phonetic alphabet and writing and really the full implementation of widespread agriculture. So you can think that he's writing during the Industrial Revolution and comparing like US and European society to some of these groups that we're actually just making first contact with. And so I don't know the exact number, but between the early 1800s and mid 1900s, we made contact with numerous groups from globally that had never actually been exposed to kind of Western ways. And so an example, kind of to disprove Morgan's theory, you can actually look at how we have just today the coexistence of many modes of subsistence. So one of the key take-home messages is that you don't go from foraging to pastoralism to agriculture to agribusiness, but rather these are all different modes of subsistence that are coexisting globally. And so, for example, the Paraha are a modern hunter-gatherer tribe that live along the Amazon in Brazil. They have a combination of hunting, gathering, and now because their land is being encroached, they are starting to use more agricultural practices, but it's not necessarily by choice. The Duca pastoralists, this is a group that lives in northern Mongolia, and they herd reindeer, and they've been herding reindeer for numerous centuries. I mean, even if you look in Georgia, so this is Joe. He's the head of Love is Love Farms or Gaia Gardens. It's a really awesome CSA that's in East Atlanta that they accept volunteers at. So if you'd be interested in doing something like that, his farm, it's a fully organic farm that offers really awesome produce to the local community. And then you see what we often see if you've ever driven across the country, like Midwest, you see these large commercial agricultural operations. And so if you think about all of these different modes of subsistence, you can think about how the different cultural and social aspects that surround all of these different forms of consumption differ. And so just to remind you again, agriculture and agribusiness has been brief, and we're going to kind of travel back at least 10,000 years to talk about more of how this developed. And so these areas that are highlighted here in red are kind of the hotbeds of the Neolithic transition, or the agricultural revolution. There are a lot of different terms across the literature that are used to discuss this. One very, very key fact to keep in mind is that agriculture isn't something that arose in one place and then this great, wonderful, intelligent civilization taught everyone else how to do it. We see agriculture arising independently across the globe, but it does happen to all be occurring between about 10,000 and 5,000 years ago. And this is partly because we also see at the same time major shifts in the climate. And so we can see this, the trend to where the ice caps are starting to melt. And so this is like leading to major changes in the environment in general. So the grasslands are changing. It's harder to be a pastoralist group because you have to go further to get the same types of supply for your herds. And this is also when you're starting to see population size changing. And so when you have a larger population, you need to have a way to supply these people. And so there's a really interesting area of research where it's sort of a chicken and the egg, which came first. Did the population grow and then a group adopts agriculture to support it? Or did they become agriculturalists and then the population grew as a result of increased food supply? And those are questions that are really difficult to answer, but we can go through later some of the evidence that you can use to help answer those questions. And so I think the place to start here is with plant domestication. So when you're thinking about like how do we know when agriculture actually developed in an area, what are some of the things that we're looking at? And so here we're using predominantly archaeological evidence. And so for example, a stalk of wheat can survive 10,000 years. And so we can look at that stalk of wheat and look at the seed packet, for example, to see how it looks in comparison to what we see today. And so with seed dispersal, with domesticated seeds, everything is kind of packed in tight because we're trying to control how the plant is reproducing. Whereas in wild type species, the seeds like naturally fall off. Like if you think of like a dandelion, is it a dandelion? That you would blow like the little white flower that you can blow the leaves off of. Like that's an example of seed dispersal. If you think about what an ear of corn looks like, the corn seeds are not naturally flying off the stalk. You can also see that the reproductive organs of the plant are larger than the wild type counterparts. And why do you think that would be? Why would the reproductive organs actually be larger in domesticated plants? Yeah.
Aren't the ovaries of plants, or aren't they normally the fruit? So people would obviously want like larger fruits so they could get more for.
Exactly. So through the process of artificial selection, we've enhanced the product of the plant itself. Yeah. And then You can also use genetics just to look to see how plants have changed. So you can look at ancient DNA and really compare and contrast the different mutations and changes over time to kind of establish the relative change over time. So the first example, and the most common example for this, is with Teosinte, or maize. And so Teosinte is the wild-type ancestor of corn that we see today. And here for comparison, you can see a quarter. So if you look at this, this is what we today would call like the corn. And so you can see that there's a limited number of kernels. They're not quite as tightly packed together, so you can think of how those seeds might disperse naturally. And if you look at it, the husk itself is much thinner and smaller. So again, that would enable the seed dispersal to improve. And it's also a much bushier plant. And so you can think about how when the plant is going from its wild type stage into its modern stage that you see today, we've selected it so that we can grow more corn all together in rows. Like, it works for agriculture. Whereas this, if you think about how would you harvest corn coming off of the Teosinte plant in a mass production environment? It would be very difficult. It'd be very labor intensive. Whereas, has anyone ever seen corn be harvested? Anyone from the Midwest? Could you describe it?
They have like a big machine, like tractor looking thing that kind of like just grabs the plant so it goes over them.
Yeah, they have these big tractors that just plow through the fields and rip all of the corn right off the top. That wouldn't have been possible without having domesticated it to work for our culture, essentially. And so domestication occurred predominantly in Central America and Mexico. And if you think of the main trinity of food in Mexico, even today, the tortilla and beans, like these were domesticated right around the same time. And in part, this is because these help to provide like your full complement of like nutrients that you require. So for example, even in Teosinte, the lysine content is quite small, but you need that as an essential amino acid. And if you're consuming the maize in combination with other beans or legumes, you can kind of create this whole nutrient. So you see these two being domesticated together. It's similar to wheat domestication and chickpea domestication in the Middle East. It's another example that follows a similar role. And so with Teosinte, in comparison to maize, from what we can tell by using this archaeological evidence and analyzing the protein content, the lysine content, and other nutrients, we can see, for example, that protein was higher in the wild-type version, lysine is higher in the wild-type version. And it also has these innate resistance to different pests and infections, whereas in modern, like agriculturally cultivated corn, it's more at risk for different diseases. That's also partly why corn is so sweet. It makes us enjoy it more. And so another example is sorghum. So sorghum was domesticated at least by 4000 BC in Ethiopia. And part of why I say at least by is because this is what we know based on the evidence that we have at hand today. So different digs, like archaeological projects, are occurring all the time. And so one thing that I really find exciting about this field is that we're always learning more, because we're always discovering more. But it also makes it so that you always kind of have to be kind of at the top of your game, really thinking about like how do these new findings compare to old findings, and how do we really integrate this within the theoretical framework that we work in. And with sorghum, we see intensive modification of the seed shell. This is actually an example from a photo where they're trying to undomesticate the sorghum. So they're trying to help it return to its more wild type state so that we can learn more about how seeds would have spread and how the plant could have been used. And then one of the ways in which sorghum was used in prehistory was actually to brew beer. And one thing that's really interesting with this is that you can actually look at the bones today under certain types of light and really see how the beer kind of got into the bones to act as an antibiotic source. And so this is actually a way in which we utilized a natural product in order to kind of help health without actually intending to. So it's sort of a positive side effect of a cultural activity. And then again with sorghum, we see increased protein and lysine content before domestication. And again, its resistance to pathogens has declined because of domestication. And a third example of a plant that I find very interesting is just the banana or the plantain. And part of what I think is interesting is that if you think about when you eat a banana and you peel it out, there really is no seed. And so we've actually modified this plant artificially to the point where it can no longer reproduce by itself, which makes it so that it's a heavily agribusiness produced product. And it's also why you can see the banana price increasing over time. And it's because it requires so much manual modification to produce, and also why it's so sensitive to disease. And so to kind of go back to animals a bit, with what we really see happening is about 10 to 11,000 years ago, we see pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats being like the first animals that we see evidence of domestication for. And we'll talk more about what type of evidence tells us what domestication means. But why would you think that pigs or goats or sheep might be among the first animals to be domesticated? What is it about those animals? Yeah.
They're smaller than cattle and more controllable.
Right. So the whole point with animal domestication is that you've got to learn how to control the animal, you've got to learn how to live with it, and how to basically be able to move it with you. So if you, a lot of animal domestication is affiliated with early pastoralism as well, and this is because those animals are easier to herd. And so to interpret evidence of animal domestication, you're really relying here on the bones of the animals themselves. And so whenever you're doing an archaeological project, like one of the first things or one of the most important things that you're doing is really separating human bones from animal bones. And there's a whole corps of specialists who literally their specialization through their academic training has been to really understand cattle bones or other types of, to be able to really discreetly separate these different categories. And one thing that you see is the rapid reduction of body and tooth size. And so that's related to the fact that we need to control the animal, we need to keep it safe, we need to keep us safe. And so this is also when you're starting to see cultural evidence of building fences, for example. And tooth size reduction just improves your safety, but it's also related to the types of foods that the animals are starting to eat. So in the wild, they may have had a different diet than they do now. You also see an imbalanced sex and age ratio of the animal bones themselves. And so you would see more older females than males. Why do you think you would see more females? Anyone? Yeah.
They can give birth like more, so we want them a lot more.
Right, so you would predominantly be eating the male animals because you need to preserve the females in order to continue to reproduce, but they also provide milk. And so there's another agricultural or another subsistence component that derives from agriculture. You can also, on animal bones, just like human bones, trace back DNA haplotypes to see kind of how species changed over time. And there are a lot of molecular techniques that we'll get into now. And so here's one example that is really interesting. So domesticated pigs and the wild boar. Do you think that the wild boar is an ancestor of the domesticated pig? You're shaking your head yes. Why would you say yes?
Just because they look so similar.
That's okay. Would you say that the wild boar looks more rugged, more ancestral to some degree. So one thing that's really interesting with this is that the wild boar, as you would see it, for example, if you've ever been on Catalina Island, there are wild boars running around all over. I've done excavations there where literally you have to jump out of a pit because a wild boar will charge at you. But they are descended from domesticated pigs. So this is an example of a species that was domesticated and then kind of reintroduced to the wild, or probably just ran away from home, essentially, and has redeveloped some of these features that we would actually typically say would be the more ancestral features, like the giant tusks and the really robust stature. So what's interesting with this, and you can see this with plants also, is that there is no progression through time. So features change in relation to how the environment changes all of the time. And another example of how we can artificially manipulate an animal, these are all different subspecies of sheep, and none of this has been produced through genetic manipulation. This is just through artificial breeding. So where you can get these very nice fluffy white coats, you can get the scratchy type wool, bigger ears, very cute faces. And so that's just an example of what you can achieve through artificial selection. And so some of the evidence that you're using when you're trying to talk about what people used to eat, how did agriculture change, and how did food products change. Here you can, for example, on the right side, this is an example of an ice core, where you're trying to get information out of a glacier that can tell you about how climate changed over time. So you can think about how climate would affect how plants grow and the types of animals that could survive in these different environments. This is an example of how you can look at the shape of a bone to look at its robusticity. These are all different methods. And a more molecular method that you can use is you can actually look at the different carbon isotopes within the plant samples that you collect. So for example, if you've done this analysis, you can kind of identify whether plants are C3 plants or C4 plants. And C3 plants are the older plant version, and C4 plants have evolved independently multiple times. And this is in relation in part to how climate has changed over time as well. And so this, by looking at the plant itself, we can actually kind of reconstruct the whole environment around it. And so this is an example of how you could use these carbon isotope signatures. So when you run the analysis and you get a value. And so we know based on modern vegetation, kind of the expected values that we would get for certain types of plants. And so this is all evidence that we use to build a picture. And one of the most important things with archaeological data is that out of all of the possible evidence we may have, we may actually only be privy to a very small amount. And so we often are using what's called strong inference. If you've taken a class with George Armelagos on campus earlier, he's kind of the epitome of this method, where it's you take all of the data that's available and try to use your best effort to accurately reflect the environment, but always describing your limitations. And so another method that you can use is to actually look at the nitrogen isotopes as well. And so when you have this, both types of data, you can really build a strong axis to try to pinpoint the types of chemicals that you're seeing in the bone. And so these are examples where you're actually taking the carbon or the nitrogen isotopes out of the bone itself. And so, for example, you can reconstruct a human diet, you could reconstruct an animal diet, and really pinpoint the types of foods that they're eating. And so one example that's an interesting one is where there was one study I've read that they looked at the bones of, they were all turned out to be women who were literally in a mass grave. And you can see that they were consuming low quality food products, almost all corn or maize, in relation to the kind of burials of the kings and queens that were adjacent to this pit, who had like evidence of high protein content, a very diverse diet. And so this is a way in which we can kind of look at how society is structured using a chemical signature. And so I think this kind of leads us to the question of why would you adopt agriculture? And so this goes back to the question that I mentioned in the beginning, where we're kind of in a chicken and an egg issue. Which came first? Did populations grow? And then we needed to devise, and independently we needed these different ways to devise to provide stable food sources? Or did we develop agriculture and then decide to stay around for a while? And so there are three key kind of competing theories. The first would be the domestication hypothesis. And this is that this was a way to cope with how the environment is changing all around us. And so it was sort of a more planned attempt in order to promote livelihood, I guess you could say. Another theory that's proposed is with optimal foraging, is that basically groups decided, it's not necessarily that they got together, had a powwow and decided to do something, but that over time it seemed that hunting and gathering was no longer an efficient way to get calories, and so they adopted more agricultural techniques in order to reduce caloric expenditure. And a third is just a social hypothesis, that this helped to develop these storage thresholds that allowed some people to get more power than others and reduce equality, and that over time this created a stratified society that was beneficial to some who helped to kind of carry on that tradition. And so agriculture brings along with it a number of different social changes that you can see in the archaeological record. One of them is sex-based labor differences. And so this is really where you see the creation of so-called men's work and women's work. But you actually can see this in bone. So for example, in the bones of women that I've seen from a couple of different sites in Mexico, if you actually look at the patella, so the knees of women's bones, they're eroded in a way that really basically means that they were leaning down with a lana metate grinding corn. And you don't see that same evidence on men. Another example is just how time is spent. This is, again, kind of where we see this division of labor, of women being closer to the household, men hunting, women associated more with like fruits and nuts and things like that. And this is where we see the first evidence of social stratification. And so with the production, or with the implementation of agriculture, you do develop a tiered society where there are some people who are the field workers, and there are some people who are the organizers of the field. And then there are some people who have no interplay with the actual field itself, but are rather controlling how this is being distributed both within their own communities and being traded outside. And so you really see this change in even the kind of cultural and social emblems of these areas. And so this is when you see, in terms of burials, more differences between grave markers, for example, or between the types of artifacts that people are buried with. And one of the biggest changes that has the most effect on health is that we have this reduced dietary niche. For example, if you are implementing agriculture, you can't grow every single plant that you see. You have to make decisions. What's going to work the best in the environment? What produces the fastest, so you can make sure that you have a continual food supply. And this reduced dietary diversity means that you might not be meeting all of your kind of daily requirements to be the most healthful that you can be. And then this, tied with social stratification, might mean that certain groups of people have access to some foods and not others. And another impact of agriculture is sedentary life in general. And so this you see increases in population density, which leads to increase in disease transmission. You're around animals continuously, so you've got this new disease vector, and you have human waste. This is something that hunters and gatherers don't deal with in the same way. If you're constantly moving locations, you don't have literally a pile of your own waste that you have to deal with. And so this is why, this is part of why we think that with agriculture you see some of these emerging health effects. And so this kind of gets us to some of the methods with the bones specifically. So bioarchaeology is just the general study of all the human remains that are exhumed. And then paleopathology is really the specific examination of the disease patterns on bone. And one of the most important things to keep in mind is that we use the individual as the case, but we really are looking at population level norms. So why do you think we need to do that? Why would we pull back to the population level with this type of data? Yeah.
Well, it would show more consistency because individuals, they can vary, but if we look at a population, then the evidence would be more substantial.
Yeah, so there's human variation. And so part of this is that whenever we're digging a site, we don't necessarily know that we're fully representing the entire group. One person may have multiple afflictions, but if we continued the dig and then found 100 more bodies, none of those bodies may actually have the same conditions that the first did. And so by focusing on a population level, we can try to more accurately represent the general case. And so what are some types of evidence? So what are some types of cultural artifacts that you think we could use from excavations to tell us about health?
You could use art to depict certain pictures.
Yeah, so artistic representations of health. Yeah.
Like tools, if there's like drawing stuff or artist things.
Yeah, so any kind of tool use or everyday objects. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say like utensils.
Yeah. And what about biological artifacts?
Skeletons.
Yep. Skeletons. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, teeth hold an amazing amount of information. You can even look, migration is often examined through teeth because you can look at the fluoride content of water and trace that over time. Okay, so with cultural artifacts, art and other depictions of history, written documents if they were in existence at that time, and then mortuary practices. So we learn a lot about how people lived based on how they're buried. And then with biological artifacts, skeletons with teeth, mummies are very helpful. You can actually do tissue analysis with mummies if they've been preserved, if they've been well preserved. We've done projects where you can actually run a mummy through a scanner and look at their coronary arteries and look for evidence of heart disease. And that was very prevalent across Egypt in the Middle Kingdom, which is after their transition to agriculture. Another object that you can use are coprolites. Does anyone know what those are? It's just like petrified poop. So we can look to see how the body was actually processing different food articles and even pick through it to look for undigested products. And so here I just kind of want to give a reminder that we see examples of forensic science of bioarchaeology on television fairly frequently in shows like CSI or Bones. In CSI, everyone is working in the dark and they're working in white suits and high heels, and that is not happening. And they inject a sample in and it is processed within not even 5 minutes, within 30 seconds. Or the technician who jumps on the computer and is instantly hooked up to the FBI database. I've worked in a coroner's office. We do not have access to FBI files. That's not happening. And so some of some of what you see on television is kind of an artificial recreation. So if you're interested in going into this as a field, that's not quite the job that you're going to have. It's more like this, where you have a plot. I've spent many, many hours and months inside a dirt pit using a toothbrush or using a paintbrush in order to very, very finely scrape dirt off of a bone. And then you have to draw everything multiple times because you really want to get this temporal aspect, because things that are buried below others, like that can help reconstruct the timeline of events. Or you're spent here in the lab categorizing things, labeling things, being very precise. And so those are just some things to keep in mind as you watch these shows. And so I like the phrase, the skeletons in our closet. So we use skeletal remains in order to understand the history of health, with the recognition that we know that we don't have all of the information about all of the people who have ever walked on the earth before. And so the skeletons provide a general demographic profile. So for example, one of the common things that you do is you age, we call it age and sex the individual. So we try to determine if it's male or female and approximately what age it is. And so we can use that to kind of see the general trends in society. For example, right now we're seeing that we have an increased base of people who are over the age of 65 and a decreased base of people who are under age 18. And so that may have very specific implications for our economics as we go forward. And what we're also looking at here with the bone itself are for congenital abnormalities. And we'll go through these with some pictures. Mechanical loading, so that's like how are people using their arms. Modern studies of tennis players that have been x-rayed, you can tell that a tennis player is right-handed or left-handed because the muscle attachment sites on their bones get bigger because they have more musculature there, and they need to weight, it's called loading. They need to load the bones in a different way. So for example, and this is a femur, let's do the humerus. In this humerus, we'll ignore this for right now, but this muscle attachment site would get larger and larger based on use. And so you see in the archaeological record, males tend to have one arm that is larger than others, and we relate that probably to hunting. You can see evidence of infectious disease, injuries or violence, nutrition, dental health, and then violence. And so this is a static look at a dynamic process. So keep in mind that these people died at one specific moment in their lifetime. And so while certain aspects of the body, you can learn more about early health. So for example, in the teeth, you can look at fluoride content and see where they were born, because most of that content is stored in the enamel really early in life. But other parts of the bone are remodeling all of the time. So for example, if you break your arm, that can heal over time until you survive it. And so some of the evidence of that fracture may disappear. And so here are just a couple examples of what we use as evidence that were referenced throughout the article, just to give you a little bit more insight. So for this, is it okay, Cassie, if I just turn the lights down a little bit? Let's see. This will help. So here you can see the porosity on the bone. And what porosity means basically are just small little holes. They almost look like pinpricks, and they're all right here on the skull. And so I'm going to pass around a couple of things. These are all, with the exception of this, these are all real bones. So please be very gentle with them and respect them, because they are a living person whose body has been donated in some way to science, whether purposefully or not. So what you'll see here are the different porosities. And so you'll see especially right here in the orbit. So this right here is just my frontal bone. And porosity is associated with an infection that sometimes you can actually diagnose, but not always. So we really think of this as a generalized infection or an instance of anemia. And so one of the difficulties with skeletal biology is that different disease processes can leave the same signature on the bone. In this case, with the porosity of the eye orbit, that is more commonly associated with anemia, and we know that because we see that in kids today. Another example that we can see very readily are cavities or excess like dental calculus and tooth loss. And so right here, this hole in the tooth is a cavity. And so if you think about like modern dentistry, these weren't being replaced. This was just something that you lived with on a day-to-day basis. So that kind of tells you something about the quality of life of these different groups. And with the transition to agriculture, we see an increased evidence of cavities. And so why would you think that would be with agriculture as compared to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle? Right, so you're eating more products that have a higher carbohydrate content or a higher sugar content. So like corn. Here you can also see there would have been a tooth here, another molar, but it's actually been lost and then the bone has resorbed. So one thing that's interesting that you can look at is, and this is in part used to age skeletons, but you also have to think about like what is the dietary history going on as well. I'm going to pass this around, and you can see an example where a tooth is starting to be resorbed. It's a little bit difficult to see, but you can also look at this. It has cavities. The dentin is completely exposed. This would be very, very painful. A huge cavity right in the front. And so this is your left mandible. There you go. Congenital abnormalities are very prevalent. So this is an example of scoliosis as an adult. And so you can see the spinal curvature here. And what's interesting when we see these types of anomalies is that it really shows us how compassionate people are. Because if you think about if your spine was shaped in this way, how difficult would it be to kind of experience a normal daily life? So this really helps to give us evidence of how people regarded one another and the types of care that was provided. And this is also an example of spina bifida right here. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is the sacrum, and it's not fused. Normally this bone is fused together so that the spinal cord can run through it. And this child, I believe they were 10 or 11, and this is a condition that even today is difficult to survive from. And the other kind of macroscopic features are non-specific stress. So enamel hypoplasia is something that we associate with having poor nutrition and restricted health, and also a high carbohydrate diet. And these are just small lines on your teeth, and you see these in people today, even in the US. Other examples of infectious disease. So this is syphilis. This is what syphilis does to your bones. And this is an example. This is not a real skeleton. But here you can see all of this pitting where it's literally the infection is so widespread and the inflammation is so high that it is chopping away at the skeleton. A couple other examples are fractures. So here you can see this bone has been fractured. This is a normal tibia. Yeah, this is a normal tibia, and this is a fractured tibia. And you can tell that it's healed because it's not broken in half, and there's evidence of remodeling. And here's an example we can pass around. This is an ulna on the right. And this is an example of a fracture where you can see normally the bone would be more of a smooth surface, but instead it's developed this bony protuberance in an effort to heal itself. And this is just blunt trauma. That's like an axe to the head. So that they survived from. And so other features you can see are nutritional deficiency. And again, this is something we still see today with rickets, so a vitamin D deficiency. So here's a femur. So the head of the femur isn't attached because it's in a child. So that this portion of the bone doesn't actually fuse on until later in life after this individual had died. But a femur should be straighter, and instead you see this curvature. And you've probably seen images of kids that are walking around that have bowed legs, and that's a result of this deficiency. Here are a couple osteoporosis you can see. So this is a Colles fracture. It's just right here on the wrist. Still very common in women over 65 today. And one of the pieces of evidence that I've used frequently is stature. And so the process of growing is a very dynamic process, and it strongly represents your experiences in early life, because this is when your bones are growing at their fastest rate. And so if you're experiencing a nutritional deficiency, an infectious disease, other hardships, if you experience those in early life, you can see them manifest even into adulthood by decreased stature. And this is again where the population perspective becomes important, because evidence of one very small individual could be an example of like dwarfism. Whereas if you have multiple individuals who are shorter than what we would expect, that may be an indicator of reduced health. And so part of how we use stature in the archaeological record is to use kind of comparative groups that exist today. So, for example, even going back to the Industrial Revolution, we have really good records of average heights. So we can look at how average height has changed in the modern world in relation to changes in environment, stressors, disease processes, and use that to make these strong inferences back into the past. And so, but one thing that you have to keep in mind is that there's a great deal of human variation. So does anyone know who these two people are? Who are they?
Danny DeVito.
Yeah, so Danny DeVito is on my left. And who's the other? Right. And so these are two examples of men living today who have vastly different height differences, but neither one is necessarily considered abnormal. They're both within the range of expected human variation. So that's something that is very important when keeping in mind when you're looking at an individual versus the population. And so in archaeology, we're using a lot of different tools all at once to pinpoint our best argument for what we're observing. And so one of the key things when you're thinking about stature is how old is someone? You wouldn't necessarily want to evaluate height the same way on a 10-year-old boy as you would on a 60-year-old man, because the growth process hasn't finished yet for the kid. And so what you're doing here is you're using all of these other elements of the body to help you to establish how old they are. And you can also use the teeth in order to look at how old someone is. For example, your third molars or your wisdom teeth don't come in until you're an adult. So when we see those in prehistory, that kind of helps us to say they are definitely an adult. It's kind of another line of evidence. And so again, what we're doing is literally taking measurements and comparing those measurements to age-matched reference samples. And one of the biggest issues with archaeology right now is what is an appropriate sample? Who do we look for to determine what stature should be, what is healthy? Is it a US population? Is it a European population? Should we take everyone's heights from across the globe and put them into a database and determine it that way? So these are all questions that we think about when doing this work. And the other thing that's an issue with looking at stature is that you may have a humerus and you may have a tibia, and that's it. So how do you estimate someone's height when you only have two bones? And so there are probably upwards of 50 different types of equations that you can use to estimate height, depending on what types of elements you have. So for example, you could use just the calcaneus, your heel bone, to estimate height and weight. That may be less accurate than if you had the femur plus the tibia, but sometimes you have to do with what you have. So there are many different methods, and that for the paper that you read that me, George Armelagos, Emily Esch, and Josh Robinson, who are also graduate students in the anthropology department, wrote, one of the biggest issues that we had in trying to do this literature review was the fact that all of these different people use all of these different methods, and how do you equate them into one analysis? Another feature that we examined was skeletal robusticity. And so this is where you see both genes and the environment coming into action. So like I mentioned before, you can see with the tennis player, the bone that becomes more robust with excess use. Another way of looking at it, this is an example, this is a Neanderthal skull, and this is an early-ish Homo sapiens skull. And what you can see here are that the supraorbital tori, or the brow ridges, are very, very robust compared to what we see here and what we see today. And so this is a loading place for the muscles of the jaw. So the muscles that can go underneath the mandible scoop up and then connect onto the top of the skull. And so we can kind of make inferences about diet based on how the facial musculature looks between different specimens. Okay, so the work that you read from George and I, what we were doing here is really building on some of his previous arguments and trying to tackle a question that he's been interested in for quite a long time. And so before they started this work, the prevailing idea was that the transition to agriculture must have been this amazing time for human history and human health, because wow, we have all of this food now. But what do you think are some of the cultural situations at the time that may have prompted that type of idea? Why would agriculture seem like it's the best of the best? So you have booming industry in the US and Europe, but you also have this the beginnings of the GMO revolution, where people are really saying, how can we genetically change crops to make them even better? So a lot of pro-agriculture. And you have in the 70s, 60s and 70s, you also have the modification of rice. So there was this idea, we're going to create these hybridized rice products that we're going to take overseas and erase malnutrition for the world. So there's a lot of social reasons why it would have been good to assume that agriculture is good for health. But there wasn't much data actually to support this. And part of this was because a lot of the reports that had been published previous to this were reports that said, for example, just focused on one area of research. So it would report on the dental history. It would report on the infection. It would report on the congenital abnormalities. But they weren't necessarily giving holistic views of the entire site or the entire population. And so 3 of the big developments that their work brought to our field itself is that it emphasized this population level view rather than focusing on individual case studies. And case studies are very important, but when we're really trying to make broad statements about agriculture in Egypt, we need to focus on more than just a single individual remain. They also included the cultural and social components and really thought about how does the environment affect health, and what aspects of the social world would have maybe made some people have access to resources and others not. And they also just used as many data points as possible to signify poor health. So again, not relying on just the number of cavities or just height. And so part of our goal for this work was really to do a follow-up study, because it had been a little less than 30 years since this had been accomplished. And so what we focused on were publications where they had included all 3 of these elements. So that it mentioned that agriculture was changing at this time, and they had evidence of the transition to agriculture, these multiple indicators of stress, and included stature. And in part, we're using stature because this is an element that's used in public health as a way to measure nutritional improvement and change. So for example, when you think about projects that are abroad that are trying to improve child welfare, one of the key measures of welfare is height. And so this is an area where we could kind of show some of the nuances in using height. And so just kind of an overview of our study is that we found in more than half of cases that stature declined. And in 2 examples that we reviewed for our study, we see either no change or limited change. And so what we tried to do was really kind of think about what are some of the reasons in the data itself that these findings didn't support our hypothesis. So this was a very hypothesis-driven approach. We went in with the assumption that agriculture would lead to reduced health. And so that's when you read the article, you can see it framed in that way. And so one of the biggest issues that we found in these studies is that the definition of agriculture and the temporal span of the results that were included was vast. So for example, in some of these studies where stature was found to increase over time, like for this Bronze Age Britain study, the study itself included bones from individuals who lived over 4,000 years. If you think about how different society would have been in each of those like mini epics, you can think about how difficult it is to do this at a population level. And so these are just some kind of summaries of some of the different findings that we had. And overall, what we found is that even if stature itself didn't decline, we do see these increases in infectious lesions, in cavities, and in other like general health effects. And so some of this could be because of genetics, and some of it could just be because they were meeting the nutritional requirements in order to grow, but not necessarily achieve like full livelihood or full health. And so one of the things we also found interesting here was that stature decreased with agriculture globally. So it wasn't that only evidence from the Middle East showed statural declines, or only evidence from like Central America, but it was this like kind of global finding that we found very strongly supported our hypothesis. And in terms of robusticity, this is a very difficult thing to even evaluate. Is it nutrition, or is it environment, or is it genetics? Does it reflect labor and activity? Does it reflect overall health? So this is something that we're still kind of working through. But one thing that we did find was that whenever robusticity was increasing, the terrain was relatively flat, whereas a rugged or more mountainous terrain was associated with declining robusticity. So this may indicate that there are different agricultural practices occurring depending on the terrain itself. So for example, if you've ever seen in the highlands of Peru, the very like cut agriculture, the like terraced agriculture, versus what we see today with like a flat open landscape, that may affect how the body develops. And so just to kind of summarize is that the archaeological record is very difficult to interpret, and the only way to do it is to use multiple lines of evidence. And what's really fun about this is that you're also often working with an interdisciplinary team. So you're involving chemists, you're involving biologists, you're involving archaeologists, anthropologists, kind of the whole scheme. And that in order to really interpret your findings in environmental and a social perspective is really the key here to really help differentiate between some of these sometimes contradictory results. And that while you're looking at an individual, you really need to focus on the population level. And so in relation to agriculture and health specifically, you see social differentiation, kind of social hierarchies developing in relation to agriculture. You see an overall decline in stature, and also increases in other like signs of infection and some of these anomalies we discussed. And so just kind of a quick take-home quiz. So in relation to the agricultural transition, is the statement true or false? We have already collected and analyzed all of the data that's available on this topic. False. Okay. Good. Agriculture is always associated with improved health. Okay. Agriculture was created in one place by a highly intelligent civilization and then spread across the globe through population contact. Okay, and evidence of cultural norms and activities does not contribute to our understanding of ancient health. Good. Okay, that's it. Does anybody have any questions?